Buenas tardes. En esta edición de Ingenious Mind Summit 2020 tenemos el honor de contar con la participación de Peter Harris, director de Sustentabilidad de UPS, compañía global de paquetería y mensajería. Además de su puesto directivo en esta compañía transnacional, Peter es director de Low Carbon Vehicle Partnership, una entidad público-privada en el Reino Unido, cuyo propósito es acelerar el cambio a vehículos y combustibles bajos en emisiones de carbono. También forma parte de la Comisión de Política de Innovación Verde del Reino Unido, que reúne a empresas progresistas y académicos destacados para identificar cómo las políticas pueden apoyar la innovación verde en la economía del Reino Unido y hacer crecer las empresas que la ofrecen. Adicionalmente, forma parte del Net Zero Transport Board, un pequeño grupo de representantes de la industria y el mundo académico, convocados por el secretario de Transporte del Reino Unido para guiar al sector hacia el logro de cero emisiones netas de gases de efecto invernadero para el 2050. El día de hoy nos hablará sobre estrategias de movilidad y sustentabilidad.
Good afternoon. My name is Peter Harris. I am the International Sustainability Director at UPS, and it's my pleasure this afternoon to talk to you about the subject of sustainable logistics. Let's start with a brief introduction into UPS. You can see from this slide that our business is all about global logistics. We move things around the planet. We move about 3% of global GDP on a daily basis, so it's a big business, takes a lot of people, requires a lot of vehicles, and we burn a lot of fuel. We live in a world where change is dominated by large megatrends, things that are happening around us on a global basis, from urbanization through to emerging markets, the growth of e-commerce, climate change. These are the things that dominate our lives. And when we think about how to run UPS in a sustainable manner, we take those global megatrends into account through a process that we call materiality. This is something that we do once every few years, where we stand back and we ask our external and internal stakeholders what's important to them about the way in which the world is changing and therefore the way in which UPS needs to focus its sustainability efforts. And the results of our recent materiality analysis are shown here on this screen. You can see that there are 4 pillars. And I'm going to concentrate for the rest of today's presentation on 2 areas, starting, perhaps unsurprisingly, with emissions and congestion. Given the size of our global operation, the number of assets that we operate, our global ground fleet, our global airline, the amount of fuel that we burn, it's probably reasonable that you would imagine these are key priorities for us from a sustainability context. So in order to understand the emissions question, we need to ask ourselves, what happens when we burn fuel? This is an equation for the burning of any form of carbon-based fuel in air. And you can see that the products on the right-hand side are firstly water, that's fine, but secondly CO2. CO2, of course, is a greenhouse gas. If we look at this graph is actually for Europe, but you would see similar types of graph, similar shapes of graph for other parts of the world as well. The transport sector, that's the business of moving people and goods around the area covered by the graph, is actually the line at the top. It's an outlier in terms of performance relative to other economic sectors. So it's the only sector of the economy that has not managed to improve its greenhouse gas performance in the last 3 decades. That's clearly a challenge for society and for our business. But CO2 is not the only problem. If you look at the equation again, you can see that on the right-hand side, there are also things labeled as C, that's carbon, frequently known as particulates, and also NOx, NOx, nitrous oxides. And these are the chemicals that create urban air pollution of the type that you can see in this picture, which is a dominant problem all over the world, wherever we look. Large cities are suffering from air pollution challenges. So we have a twin-track challenge to contend with as society, as an organization. So we need to ask ourselves, what can we do about it? And I find it useful at this point to break emissions down into a series of factors, which I'm showing on the screen now. Quantity of goods movement, energy used per unit of goods movement, and emissions per unit of energy. Those three multiplied together, which have these units, give us the quantity of emissions produced. And if you think about what each of these represents, the first one, reducing that first factor, the quantity of goods movement measured in ton kilometers, that's all about how efficient are we. The second one, reducing the energy used per unit of goods movement, that's also about how efficient are we, but in a slightly different way. And then the third one, how much emissions do we produce per unit of energy, that's about what fuel are we using to power the assets that we're using to move our goods. So the conclusion then is that to drive emissions down, we need to focus on efficiency and alternative technologies, different types of fuel. I'm going to look at both of these in turn and give some examples for the UPS network on ways in which we can drive forward with these factors. So let's start with efficiency. Now, from a UPS perspective, one of the key drivers of efficiency is what we call network consolidation. So the scale of our global network as an airline, but also as a global ground fleet, allows us to consolidate, to optimize the use of our assets, to make sure that we've got all of our assets fully utilized and operating in a maximally efficient way. So network consolidation is crucial to efficiency, and it's dependent very much on the scale of the network that we operate. Another example of efficiency is perhaps less obvious, but it's centered on dynamic route planning, the optimization of daily routes. So a UPS driver in an urban context will complete maybe 120 delivery and pickup stops on a daily basis. And optimizing the way in which that is done is surprisingly difficult. You might think that it's simply a matter of having a giant satellite navigation system running in the background, similar to one that you might have in your car for getting from A to B. And in some ways it is, but the problem in this case is that the number of alternative routes that the system that does that calculation has to conjure with is equivalent to the number of different ways that there are to deliver 120 stops, the number of different orders in which those stops could be approached. And when you work out what that number is, it turns out to have a lot of zeros, a very large number of zeros. And that's the reason why it's only very recently, in the past few years, become possible for big data type technologies using supercomputers to tackle this in a way that is better than an experienced human. But this is the leading edge of big data technology and is now helping us to drive efficiency progress in terms of route planning. Third example is in our airline, and in aviation, there's no single bullet to making an airline efficient. It's all about 100 small changes applied simultaneously, from reduced weight air containers to winglets to more sophisticated ways of washing engines. Each of these makes a small improvement, and since 2005, we've been able to reduce our aviation airline carbon intensity by about 13%. That's quite an achievement. The final example I'll give in terms of efficiency is about the products and services that we provide to our customers. So it's not all about what we do just in our own operational network. It's also about what we offer to our customers. And you can see from this slide that all the way from the start of the process, analysis through packaging and then shipping, then receiving and then returning, there are options that we provide to customers throughout the entire journey that give the customer the ability to make their shipping with us even more efficient and even less carbon intensive. But enough about efficiency. Let's move on to that other solution that we said was important alongside efficiency, which is moving to different types of technology, different types of fuel altogether. You can imagine that efficiency in a way is like making the best use of conventional technologies, squeezing down the number of assets that we use and the amount of fuel that we burn. But at a certain point, you've got to take that remaining fuel burn and you've got to replace it with a different type of fuel if we're going to really move towards zero emissions. So the question then is, which alternative technology solutions will be key to us as we go forwards? And the answer from a UPS perspective is that the key future dominant technology will be electrification. And let me explain why that is and show you what we're doing about it. Electrification is the only technology that will ultimately give us zero emissions in an energy efficient way. There are other technologies that will reduce emissions but not take us to zero. There are some other technologies that will take us to zero but not do it in an energy efficient way. We need both. So energy efficient zero emissions, that's why electrification will be so important. Let's take a look at what that looks like today and what it will look like in the future within the UPS fleet operation. And we'll start with the urban distribution vehicles. So these are the vehicles that operate in and around the towns and cities of the world, picking up and delivering packages for UPS customers. So we started down the road of urban vehicle electrification about 10 years ago by converting vehicles from diesel to electric of the type that you see on the slide here. And the reason we did that was because at the time there were no vehicles, or almost no vehicles available that it was possible to buy from new that met our requirements in electric form. And that availability is still very limited, but we didn't want to continue forever with conversions. We wanted a new vehicle solution. So more recently what we've done is to establish a partnership with a startup company called Arrival. And we have together been developing a brand new concept of urban electric distribution vehicle that you see on the right-hand side of the slide here. It's a very advanced vehicle. It's not only electric, it also includes a range of other advanced features in terms of safety and other capabilities. We have invested in Arrival. We've also committed to purchasing 10,000 of these brand new vehicles to add to our fleet in North America and in Europe over the next few years. And these vehicles will enter our rolling laboratory. The rolling laboratory is the proportion of our ground fleet that already uses some form of alternative technology, whether that be electric or any other form that we're using. And that rolling laboratory currently numbers over 10,000 vehicles out of our about 125,000 vehicle ground fleet. So you can see that we're already moving from experiment to scale with our deployment of vehicles. But it's not just about trucks in the urban context. We're also finding ways through electrification of removing trucks from the agenda altogether. And that's primarily through the use of electrically assisted cycle type operations. This is an example. It's actually in Dublin, but there are many cities around the world where we deploy this type of operation now. They all rely on a similar type of method. We bring volume, meaning packages for delivery, into the center of the city in a container of the type that you see in the background on the slide here. It could be a box, it might be a trailer, it could even be a loose load into an available building. And then from that hub, as we call it, micro hub or eco hub, we're able to deliver all day long without trucks if the circumstances are right, if the area is sufficiently dense, and if there is enough cycle-related infrastructure like cycle lanes, etc. We can work all day without trucks for the majority of the work that we do. And we've deployed this now in about 30 cities around the world, have this type of solution to a greater or lesser extent in terms of scale, and a variety of different types of asset in use, as you can see here. So interestingly, looking there on the right-hand side, the device on the top right, that's an electrically assisted quad cycle, so it has 4 wheels. We've developed that in-house in conjunction with a partner called Fernhay, and we've done that because we wanted to bring UPS truck engineering techniques to the cycle world to overcome some of the inherent advantages that occur when you take something that is generally designed really for passenger transport and you try to scale it up for freight purposes. The ruggedness that we require is typically not there, so we wanted to engineer our own solution. This is one of our answers. And then bottom right is another interesting device. This is an electrically propelled walker aid. So in some situations, we find that actually even the cycle gets in the way. We want to go beyond the cycle to simply having a UPS service provider with a voluminous, secure load that's able to follow him or her around, and the electrically assisted walker aid is able to do just that. So we're finding ways of experimenting and innovating in the urban context to go beyond the truck altogether, not only beyond diesel, but beyond the truck. And that the advantage of that is that not only does it tackle the emissions challenge, but it also takes us into a world where we're moving beyond congestion as well, because it removes vehicles from the road. When we turn to long haul and we think about what's happening with bigger vehicles, so in the UPS network, the urban distribution vehicles we've been looking at operate all day in the towns and cities. They do the deliveries and the pickups. But then overnight, our network of large vehicles, long-haul vehicles, and airplanes operate to connect the cities in the different parts of the planet together so that the same thing can take place all over the world the following day. And the question then is, of course, at what rate will electrification become viable for these larger types of assets? So for long-haul vehicles, mainstream electrification is not ready yet. However, it's approaching fast. This is, for example, a long-haul tractor-trailer from Tesla. We've ordered 125 of these for use in our US operations. We expect to see the first ones next year, and it will be very interesting to see how they perform. So it may be that this type of solution, which is pure battery electric, will work, or it could be perhaps that there will be a need for some form of power supply to be taken to the truck whilst it's on the move, and the type of technology that is used for railways with an overhead, what's called catenary power supply, could well be the most effective way of doing that. So we will see. There's a little bit of experimentation to be done there that we'll be working on over the next few years. But in the meantime, whilst that's happening, whilst that's developing, what we need is a bridging fuel, something that can work today, that can get us to the future. There's a terrific fuel called renewable natural gas, or in some countries called biomethane. It's two words for the same thing, that really has some remarkable capabilities in this regard. So it's made from organic waste, and it's chemically exactly the same as a natural gas, so it's methane, or CH4. So it burns in the way that we saw in that equation earlier. It can be used in a conventional truck engine and works very well. The technology for gas engines is proven. But in the case of renewable natural gas, because it's made from organic waste, the carbon dioxide that is created by burning the fuel is then reabsorbed by the plants that grow to create the waste. So you have a carbon neutral fuel. Actually, the carbon reduction potential is about 80%, 80% for this type of fuel. So it's really very effective and represents a remarkable bridge between now and the future, when electrification will eventually take over. So we've invested quite heavily in this technology in the US. We made the country's largest ever purchase of renewable natural gas just last year, and we've now started using this fuel in other parts of the world as well. And then lastly, in terms of aviation, so electrified aviation at scale is some way off. A lot of development needs to take place with batteries in terms of energy density for that to be feasible. But at a small scale, it's possible today, and we see it in the shape of drones. There's a drone there taking off from the roof of one of our package cars, and I'll talk a little bit later on in different circumstances about how we're using our drones, not just for emissions reduction, but for other purposes as well. So I'll just save that one. But think of drones, if you would, as kind of lightweight electrified aircraft, and the shape of things to come that will eventually reach scale and give us the ability to replace conventional large-scale airplanes as things progress. So all of these ground technologies come together into the rolling laboratory that I mentioned earlier, that currently numbers over 10,000 vehicles globally out of our about 125,000 strong ground fleet. So we're moving, as I said, from experiment to scale, and you can see here some of the more recent investments and additions that we're making to that fleet, including the 10,000 arrivals that I mentioned a little bit earlier. But it's not just about trucks that we need to be thinking. If we're electrifying a fleet, then it's, as well as having the truck, it's just as important that we're able to get the power to the truck in order to be able to recharge it. If we can't do that, then we may as well not have the truck. And actually, this power infrastructure challenge is every bit as difficult as the vehicle challenges that sits alongside it. So this is the old world, the conventional world of power supply into buildings, the one that we're all familiar with, the one where all that really needs to happen is a distribution network delivers via a meter to a load in a building, which could be, in our case, for example, lights or conveyor motors for moving packages around, that type of thing. And this world was perfectly satisfactory prior to the arrival of electric vehicles. But now that we have EVs in our fleet, the first thing that we have to take on board is the fact that for our urban distribution vehicles, we cannot make, at the moment, very good use of any on-street public recharging architecture, recharging opportunities that might exist, because our vehicles that are doing urban collection and deliveries, they're the ones that are out there stopping maybe 120 times a day. They just don't stop for long enough to be able to recharge on the road. So all of the recharging of our urban fleets needs to take place back at base in the depot overnight. And that's possible, they're there for long enough. But what that does, of course, is that imposes a very high demand on the energy that has to be brought into that depot over a relatively short time period, just over one night, to recharge a fleet of electric vehicles. So when we started to experiment with urban vehicle electrification, some almost 10 years ago now, we rapidly found that the process of getting enough energy into a building was quite difficult. And we initially approached it by purchasing upgrades to this simple network that you see in front of you. And it's possible, you can do that. It turns out that it's a very cumbersome, inflexible, expensive process to do. So more recently, we decided that it would be a good idea to try to look for technology-based solutions. So again, in conjunction with partners, partnerships, a big theme for us here. A lot of this depends on our ability to find the right partners in the transport and energy ecosystem to work with to help us get these things done. We reached out and we formed a partnership with a range of organizations to try to overcome that power supply problem using more efficient technological means. And we developed the world's first combined fleet-scale smart grid and energy storage solution that looks a bit like what you're seeing here in pictorial terms. In practice, on the ground, what it did for us was it trebled the number of electric vehicles we could recharge in a building overnight without the need to purchase any further conventional upgrades of the type that I was describing earlier. So these types of solutions will be very important going forwards as part of our drive as an organization and as an industry and a society to push down the cost of fleet electrification, both through power infrastructure innovation and vehicle innovation, to get to the point where the deployment of electric vehicles matches or beats the cost associated with deploying a conventional solution, diesel. When we can get to that point, and we're rapidly approaching it, we will get there in the next few years. When we get there, then deploying electric vehicles is no longer about just being sustainable. It becomes commercially the obvious thing to do. Then you reach a tipping point, a flip over point, where things can proceed very rapidly to very large scale. So we haven't stopped here. We're actually moving on now with a current project to try to develop an even more sophisticated system, because what we did before was about challenging the CapEx restrictions associated with upgrades. What this is all about, this complicated diagram that you see in front of you now, is all about challenging the energy cost, the OpEx, restrictions, and using, for example, the ability to trade with the grid and buy energy at the very cheapest time of the night, or even provide energy back to the grid if that can create revenue generation for the fleet. So this combination of CapEx and OpEx reduction will play very much into that process I was describing of driving down the cost of fleet electrification, getting it to match or beat the cost of the conventional solution. And what we're seeing going on here is, in actuality, a merging, a blending, a coming together of two previously separate silos of the economy, the transport silo and the energy silo. They're starting to blend and provide solutions to each other's problems. So, for example, the energy sector is bringing smart grid solutions to the transport sector in the way that we've just described and discussed. But in return, as I just touched on, what the transport sector will bring to the energy sector is the ability for the energy sector to use batteries in vehicles as an energy buffering solution. So by stopping charging or even pulling energy back out of those batteries into the energy grid. And that will become increasingly important as we try to stabilize the intermittency of renewable generation in global energy grids. So this synergizing, this coming together of these two silos, I think will be a fascinating piece of research that we need to all work on over the coming years in order to get electrification right as a global society. So let me touch briefly on the circular economy, just by way of closing off on our piece on the environment before I move to talk very quickly about another priority. So the circular economy is all about taking our existing linear model of make, use, and throw away and turn that line into a circle whereby instead of throwing things away, we find a way to reuse them in some shape or form. And a great example of this in the UPS network is a product called Loop, which is a result of our partnership with a company called TerraCycle. And Loop is a mechanism whereby through the UPS network, retail goods, consumer household goods, can be delivered to the end consumer in reusable packaging, and then taken away again to be refilled instead of needing to be thrown away. So this is a step towards eliminating all this waste packaging that we see ourselves surrounded by today. So a very interesting new initiative there, and a great example of how the logistics sector can play a key role in the circular economy. Let me quickly mention Expo 2020. So Expo 2020 will take place in Dubai next year in 2021. It would have been this year, but of course for the coronavirus challenges, it's a world expo, a kind of a world symposium where every country will have the opportunity to demonstrate its own leadership capabilities. UPS is the logistics provider for the expo, and we will be conducting that logistics in a way that allows us to demonstrate a number of these sustainability innovations that we've been discussing today. So please look out for Expo 2020, and if you have the opportunity to be in Dubai in the autumn of next year, going into the spring of 2022, then please do. So I mentioned collaborations, and a lot of our collaboration has been between private sector organizations of the type that I described, often with government support. But in addition to that, we collaborate with NGOs and government organizations around the world to get things done. Innovation is all about the coming together of minds with different views and different abilities, and we find it to be a very effective process. And it all wraps up in our global environmental goals that you can see on the screen in front of you now. We've talked a lot about vehicles, and there you can see on the right-hand side, we committed that by this year, a quarter of all the vehicles that we purchase into our global ground fleet would be alternative fuel or advanced technology, and I'm pleased to say that we've met that goal, we've met that requirement. But then moving across to the left, you can see a very ambitious goal in terms of alternative fuel usage, 40% by 2025. That's really reaching scale when we're talking about almost half. And it all wraps up into that science-based 12% reduction in absolute greenhouse gas emissions commitment by 2025 that we're setting out to achieve. We'll just move on for the last part of this discussion to another priority that comes out of that materiality analysis that we spoke about earlier. Let's shift away from the environment and think about other areas that are important to UPS. And a number of the items that are on that slide, that materiality slide, could be summed up in this statement, that we have an opportunity to and a responsibility to help those that are less fortunate than ourselves. In an organization of our scale with some 500,000 employees working in just about every community that exists around the planet, this is something that we need to take very seriously. And there are really a number of different ways in which we can do this. I'll give you a couple of examples just by way of finishing off today. So firstly, our humanitarian logistics program. This is the program through which we reach out to and actively support those communities around the planet that find themselves subject to natural disaster in some shape or form, whether that's flood, hurricane, earthquake, whatever it is. These things happen and communities need to be supported through them. And I mentioned earlier how I was going to show how we're using drones in perhaps some unusual circumstances, and this is the example I wanted to bring to your attention. So back in 2016, as you can see at the top of this slide, in conjunction with our foundation and also Zipline, we launched what was at the time the world's first national scale drone delivery service in Rwanda, with the aim of taking medical supplies into Rwanda, into areas where the road network would just not make that feasible by ground transport. And that's been very successful. We've since expanded that. We've taken it into that mechanism into other countries as well, including, for example, Ghana. And we've also developed a commercial drone delivery service. We've set up a subsidiary called UPS Flight Forward, which coordinates all of these operations. And that's achieved some groundbreaking certifications to enable us to do that. And we're now working with drone manufacturers to build out the future of drone delivery and figure out where it sits within our network. It's not going to be a case of drones taking over from trucks in every case. It's really going to be a mix of solutions going forwards. We will see trucks alongside cycles, alongside walkers, alongside drones, and a mixture of these technologies in optimum combination will represent the future of our urban-rural distribution. But humanitarian logistics is not the only way in which we can support those that are less fortunate than ourselves. We have a global volunteer program as well, which established the target of reaching a cumulative total of 20 million volunteer hours by the end of this year from the UPS community. So UPS employees donating their own time to work in ways that support less fortunate communities. And I'm delighted to say that we've met that goal 1 year early. We achieved it last year, as you can see from the chart on the right. So terrific work there by the UPS team all around the world. And again, we've summarized our efforts from a social sustainability perspective into a series of goals that you can see here on the screen in front of you, including, for example, the humanitarian logistics work there on the top left. In the middle at the top there's the volunteering target that we were talking about. We also have tree planting target and some safety goals at the bottom. And you can see the ones that have got ticks on them are the ones that we've already achieved, even though we're not at the end of 2020 yet. So some really good progress being made there. So just by way of wrapping up, I'll point out that the work that we've been doing in this area has been recognized by a range of organizations, from Dow Jones through Fortune magazine, Forbes, and others. We're delighted by that verification, if you like, of our capabilities We're certainly not intending to stop here. There's a lot more to be done, but we're very proud of what's been achieved so far. Okay, so we have some questions here that I will now tackle. And the first one is from Rafael Remo, who has asked, during this pandemic, how has UPS managed to maintain its high standards in taking care of the planet as the number of shipments has tripled, but so did the restrictions? That's a very good question from Rafael. And indeed, the world has changed in many ways in the last 6 to 9 months as a result of the coronavirus crisis. The main change from a UPS perspective has been a dramatic shift towards what we would call e-commerce, so the whole business of doing shipments using online ordering. And the effect of that has been that instead of what would have been a world in which a number of people would have gone to the shops and picked up their own packages, those packages have been shifted into logistics networks like ours. So that's resulted in an increase in volumes, as Rafael references, but also simultaneously a shift from what was previously what's called a B2B environment, so deliveries between businesses to other businesses, more towards a B2C environment, so an increase in the number of deliveries to residential, to consumer addresses. So those are challenges. They're good challenges to have because we welcome the additional business, of course. But to do that sustainably is not so easy, because what happens as business shifts from what I described there as B2B towards B2C is it becomes less dense. In other words, we're tending to deliver fewer packages to an individual location. And the way in which we're tackling that in order to remain efficient is to try to create what's called artificial density, and that means trying to rebuild the density in our network. And a good way of doing that, let me give you a great example, is through a network of what we call access points. So these are alternative delivery points that we have thousands of around the world, and we invite residential consumers, if it's convenient for them. So, for example, it could well be that a residential consumer has made an order through UPS, but they know that they're going to be out, maybe at work or whatever else during the day, so the delivery is not going to be convenient for them. They can elect instead to have a delivery made to an access point. That works better for the customer. It also works better for us because we might be able to make several deliveries to that access point, rebuilding that density, thereby driving efficiency back up. So, very good question from Rafael. There's an example of how we tried to maintain high standards of efficiency and sustainability during the coronavirus crisis. Let's move on to another question, and we have one here from Blanca Santiago. And Blanca says, mobility is constantly changing in big cities. Is it possible to anticipate or know what trends are coming in mobility and how companies like UPS are adapting to these transformations? Very good, Blanca. So lots of changes to mobility in cities. Let me pick on one or two examples. There's a really big trend, I think, in many parts of the world now, particularly accelerated by the coronavirus crisis, but it was there anyway, which is the trend towards walking and cycling. And I think we're seeing this move away from vehicles towards walkable, cyclable, more human cities, more green spaces. And you might think that this is really a passenger transport trend, and of course it is a passenger transport trend, but we see it also as a logistics trend and logistics opportunity as well. And one of the things that I mentioned during my presentation was ways in which we have been experimenting with, in many cases quite successfully, moving beyond the truck into the use of e-assist cycle and electrically assisted walker type solutions, so that we can take trucks off the street and really join in with that shift towards cycling and walking. And it's taking a lot of thought to get that right. So we don't want, for example, to only use cycle-related devices that are simply regular passenger carrying devices that have been made bigger. They tend to lack the reliability that we want, so we're bringing our own engineering skills to the table in that regard, in the way that I mentioned, creating our own devices, our own solutions. But I think that's an example. I think the broader trend here is towards sort of considerations of future urban design. And what do we want the cities of the future to look like? If we want fewer vehicles in our cities, we want less congestion, we want less emissions, then we have to find a way of not only passengers, people, but also goods being able to move in new ways, such as the use of cycles, such as the use of drones that we talked about as well. So I think that those are some of the changes that are taking place. We have another question here from Frederico Mejia, saying, how can companies take advantage of this time of crisis as an opportunity to be more sustainable? Now, that's an interesting one. I think there are a number of different angles with which we could approach this, but I think the one I'll pick on is this. A number of economies around the world are choosing to take the opportunity of the coronavirus crisis to think about the way in which their economy is structured, and to say, right, the economy has been affected by the coronavirus crisis. We're going to need to rebuild the economy post-virus. Let's think about rebuilding it in a way that makes it sustainable for the future, rather than just going back to the old model. And I think the great thing about that strain of thought, which you can see all around the world now to a greater or lesser extent, is that a lot of the thinking about the new model is towards it being a sustainable model. Yeah, let's think in terms of rebuilding in a way that means that we are carbon light, greenhouse gas light, thinking of sustainable ways of rebuilding the national economies. And that's resulting in opportunities, I think, for organizations like UPS, because in some countries now there are government partnership opportunities emerging, whereby governments are looking for innovation from organizations like ourselves to go into partnerships and deploy ideas on the street, such as the cycle logistics solutions of the type that we've been discussing. So if we can form those partnerships and we can do those things together with governments, and we can jointly make progress, then I think that's a great thing to do. And then the last question here that we have is from Alexia Ontiveros, who says, how can we improve circular economy in the automotive industry? That's another great question. We talked a little bit about the circular economy and the way in which it can operate for UPS in terms of returns logistics solutions, and I spoke about Loop as an example of that. The circular economy in the automotive industry, and I'll give another example. I mentioned briefly when we were talking about heavy trucks, long-haul trucks, about a bridging fuel called renewable natural gas. What's interesting about that fuel, although I didn't say it at the time, but if you think about it, it's actually a circular economy product, because the fact that it's made from organic waste, what's happening is that instead of that waste being just thrown away, and in fact, as a result, degenerating into methane, which is a global warming gas, we're actually using that waste. So we're creating a circular economy product out of that waste, and we're turning it into a fuel. So renewable gas is a circular economy product. It's a circular economy fuel. And I think what we're doing with it, which is an example of the way in which it can be used in the automotive industry as a fuel, is to use it to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that would be one example. And I guess the other example would be that, of course, those returns logistics solutions that I spoke about. I mentioned an example there in my presentation that related to household goods, consumer goods, but of course, automotive parts are very much subject to the same thinking. As standards increase for requirements on automotive manufacturers to be able to recycle or reuse their end-of-life vehicles in a way that avoids anything being wasted, going to landfill or needing to be incinerated, then the logistics associated with that is something which UPS and the logistics industry can play a key part in providing. So a number of different ways, and I'm sure we will find new opportunities together as well as we go forward. So I'll stop there. There's some great questions and some terrific overlap there between the automotive sector and the logistics sector. So looking forward to building that partnership in the future. With that, I will say thank you and wish you a pleasant rest of your conference and have a very good day. Thank you very much.